.NET applications use configuration files to change the way they behave at runtime. These configuration files are located in the same folder as the application executable. Let me show you a few configuration files inside Visual Studio. I've opened a solution called Configuration Files. It contains a console application, a financial library DLL, and a web application. I'm going to start by looking at the web application. They commonly have a configuration file called a web.config. It's added automatically in the project template. And this contains settings in an XML format that might be used by this web application. Now, in web applications, you typically have at least one web.config in the root directory of the website, but you can also put other web configs in children directories. So here you can see it's just XML. There's a section called configuration, and below that is a subsection called connection strings. And inside this connection string is something with the name application services. And then below that, it has some details of how to connect to this particular SQL Express database. This implies that in my C# or VB code, I could open this connection string through some code. Other applications that you might create, like console applications, don't have config files. So let me look at this console application and see what's going on here. This console application has a reference to the finance lib. That means when I deploy the application, I have to deploy the console's exe, and I also need to deploy the financial lib DLL. Luckily for me, Visual Studio, when I do a compile, and I come here and choose a build solution, I do a show all files and then look in the bin directory, you'll see that it created the exe, and it also, after it was done compiling the DLL, it made a copy here. What I want to do is write a configuration file that allows me to change the location of this DLL to put it in another location on my hard drive. I need a config file to tell this common language runtime where to go probe for that file. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a configuration file to this console app. I'll right click and choose Add New Item. And I'll come over here to the search text box and type in config. Here's the one I'm looking for, application config file. Leave the name at the default, app.config, and click add. Now the CLR, when it's looking for a configuration file for a Windows application, expects the file to have exactly the same name as your finished executable. Now my finished executable's name is console.app.exe. That means my config file should be called console.app.exe.config. The good news is if I compile the application right now, you'll see that there's now two copies of the config. This one, which I edit inside Visual Studio, and then every time I compile, it makes a copy of this and gives it the correct name. Therefore, if I ever change the compiled version of the name later, Visual Studio will change the name of the configuration file. I need to do one more thing. I need to write some code in this configuration file that will probe in new locations. I've already got the code written. It's up here in this assets folder. So here's what I'm going to use. I'm going to copy this piece here. And then switch back to the app.config and paste that in. So this is telling the common language runtime. At runtime, when you go to find an assembly, I want you to search these two extra locations, other files and the bin folder. All right, so I'm ready. I'll save and I'll compile. Then I'm going to open this folder in Windows Explorer. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this debug folder and copy it and move it somewhere else on my hard drive. So I think I'm going to move it to my desktop and paste that in. And then we'll go in here and we'll see if this application runs. I'll double click on this and the application runs and gets my payment value. Okay, now let's put a folder in here. We'll call this one DLLs, like that. And I'm going to take this financial library file, I'm going to move it in there. Now when I try to run this application, it throws an unhandled exception because the common language runtime is looking for that DLL and cannot find it. So what I can do is come into this configuration file. This is just a text file. And I can create another probe. I can say, instead of looking in a bin folder, let's look in a DLLs folder. I'll save that file. And now I'm going to double click on this console application.exe again. And it runs successfully. So that's how I can change the runtime probe for that file. So let's review. A configuration file is loaded by the .NET Runtime when the application starts up. The application reads sections of the config file to determine what settings and data to use at runtime. You can write your own code to read the sections of the config file too. Visual Studio includes a clever tool to simplify creation of application and user-specific settings. I'll show you how this settings tool works in the next movie.